Hello, welcome back to another late evening of shared rabbit holes and quiet conversations. Get yourself comfortable. If you got a blanket nearby, pull it up. Get your pillow sorted. Take a moment if you need one. There's genuinely no rush tonight, and wherever you are in the world right now, I hope it's warm and quiet. Tonight we're going somewhere that I've been wanting to go for a little while, actually. We're heading to a small fictional mountain town in Colorado. A town where the children never age, the adults are reliably useless, and the laws of physics are treated less like rules and more like mild suggestions. We're talking about South Park, and more specifically, we're talking about something that doesn't come up as often as it probably should. The fact that this show, more than almost anything else on television in the last 30 years, has had a habit of being right. Now that might seem like an odd thing to say about a cartoon where a child gets eaten by his own teacher on a semi-regular basis. But here's the thing. Beneath all of that, beneath the shock humor and the celebrity parodies and the episodes that are genuinely just about being crude and ridiculous, there is a show that has been watching the world with an unusual and sometimes uncomfortable level of accuracy. And the fandom has been watching it back, picking through every episode, every throwaway line, every recurring background detail, building theories about what the show is actually saying and what it might be quietly predicting. Some of those theories turned out to be about the show's own mythology, things that fans speculated about for years before the show confirmed them. Characters who turned out to be exactly what fans suspected. Mysteries that had answers hidden in the background long before those answers were officially given. And some of those theories turned out to be about the real world. Episodes that seemed like absurdist satire at the time, but which looked, in hindsight, less like comedy and more like an early draft of a news cycle that hadn't happened yet. I've spent a lot of time with this lately, going back through episodes, reading through the long threads where fans dissect this show in the kind of detail that would probably make Trey Parker slightly uncomfortable, and thinking about what it actually means when a comedy that has been running since 1997 keeps getting things right. Not always, not perfectly, but often enough that it stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling like something else. We'll talk about the theories fans got right long before the show confirmed them. We'll talk about the predictions, the episodes that felt like jokes until they didn't. We'll talk about what the show understood about celebrity, about politics, about technology, about human nature, that most other things weren't willing to say out loud. If you happen to drift off somewhere in the middle of all this, that's completely fine. That's the whole point of these evenings. But I think some of this is going to keep you listening a bit longer than you might expect because a few of these are genuinely strange. Strange in that specific way where you find yourself thinking, how did they know that? Before we get into any of it, if you've been enjoying what we do here and you want a way to show support, subscribing down below does mean a lot. It takes about 2 seconds and it helps more than you think. But now, let's get into it. South Park has been on the air since August 1997. That's nearly 3 decades of episodes, more than 300 of them. And in that time, it's given rise to one of the most dedicated and thorough theory communities in animation. Partly because the show has its own rich internal mythology. Things about why Kenny keeps dying, who Cartman's father actually is, what's really happening to this town that seems to attract every supernatural event in recorded history. And partly because the show has a production process that is genuinely unique in television, which gives it an unusual relationship with real-world events that no other show quite shares. We'll get into all of that properly in a moment, but before we do, I want to spend just a second on why this particular topic is worth a whole evening, because I think it's easy to dismiss it. South Park theories, that sounds like the kind of thing that lives on Reddit at 3 in the morning and involves a lot of diagrams with arrows connecting things that aren't necessarily connected. And some of it is that. I won't pretend otherwise. There are South Park theories that are deeply, impressively silly, and they have their own charm. But there's another category, and that's what tonight is about. The theories that held up, the predictions that landed, the things that fans noticed about this show, about its internal logic, about the world it was describing, that turned out to be correct. Some of them were confirmed by the show itself in later episodes or in interviews with Parker and Stone. Some of them were confirmed by events outside the show entirely, by things that happened in the actual world that had already been dramatized in a fictional Colorado mountain town years earlier. And a few of them were confirmed in ways that feel, if you sit with them long enough, genuinely strange. I should say up front, South Park is not a show with perfect continuity. Trey Parker and Matt Stone are the first to admit that. They've said many times that they care more about making something funny or interesting in the current episode than about whether it lines up precisely with something from season 4. So some of what we're going to talk about tonight will be things the show confirmed deliberately, and some will be things that fans read into the text that Parker and Stone probably weren't consciously building, but which still map onto reality in ways that are hard to ignore. That distinction matters, I think, because there's a difference between a theory the creators built in from the start and later confirmed, and a theory that turns out to describe something true about the world even if the writers were just being funny about it. Both are worth talking about. They're just interesting in different ways for different reasons. All right, I think that's enough setup. Let's actually get into it. The most logical place to start is probably the beginning, not of the theories, but of the show itself. Because before you can understand why South Park keeps getting things right, it helps to understand how the whole thing was built in the first place. Here's something that not everyone knows, even people who've been watching the show for years. South Park was never really a fictional universe in the way that other animated shows are fictional universes. Right from the beginning, it was autobiographical in ways that were hiding in plain sight. And once you know about this, it changes how you look at quite a lot of what the show has predicted and understood over the years. Stan Marsh is Trey Parker. Not symbolically, not in a vague artistic sense. Stan Marsh is Trey Parker. Parker has confirmed this many times in interviews, and the evidence is scattered all the way through the show if you know where to look. Stan's father is named Randy. Trey Parker's actual father is named Randy. Stan's mother is named Sharon. Trey Parker's mother is named Sharon. Randy Marsh works as a geologist in the show. Randy Parker, Trey's real dad, worked as a geologist. The family dog in the early seasons was named Sparky, which was the name of a real dog from Parker's childhood. And Kyle Broflovsky is Matt Stone, who grew up Jewish in a predominantly non-Jewish community and has talked about what that experience was like. Feeling like an outsider, being hyper-aware of religious and cultural difference. Being the person who often ends up being the voice of reason that nobody listens to. That's Kyle. That's his whole character. What this means, and here's the thing, is that South Park was never pure invention. It was always, at some level, a show about real people reacting to the real world. The absurdism was added on top. The profanity and the shock humor and the cartoon violence were the packaging. Underneath all of that was a pair of writers who were essentially making a show about themselves and the town they grew up in and the world they were living in. Which is why when the world catches up to something South Park said years earlier, it's often because Parker and Stone weren't extrapolating into the future. They were just describing the present with unusual clarity. And then there's the production cycle. This is genuinely unusual in television. Most animated shows have production pipelines that are anywhere from a year to 18 months long. The time between writing an episode and it appearing on air is long enough that if something happens in the world on a Tuesday, the show can't respond to it until the following year at the earliest. South Park is different. Parker and Stone built a workflow that allows them to write, animate, and air an episode in about 6 days. 6 days from blank page to broadcast. They've talked about this in various interviews and documentaries, including a behind-the-scenes film that followed the production of a single episode and was genuinely stressful to watch. What this means is that South Park has always been less like a scripted television show and more like a live broadcast that happens to be animated. When something happens in the world, a political event, a celebrity scandal, a cultural shift, Parker and Stone can respond to it within the same week, not as a reference in passing, as the central premise of an episode. While other shows are still reading about it in the news, South Park is already airing an episode about it. This is why the show gets things right so often. It's not prophecy, it's observation speed. The show's accuracy comes from the fact that it's describing things that are already happening, often in real time, in a media environment where everything else has a significant delay. When fans look back at South Park and say, they predicted this, what often happened was that South Park caught something, a cultural pattern, a social trend, a specific kind of human foolishness. At the moment, it was just beginning, before it had fully developed into the thing it was going to become. They saw it early, not because they had a crystal ball, but because they were paying attention when most people were still looking elsewhere. That said, some of what we're going to talk about tonight goes beyond that. Some of it really does feel like the show was working ahead of the curve in ways that can't entirely be explained by fast production cycles and sharp observation. And some of it involves the show's own mythology. Things about specific characters and events that fans figured out years before the show confirmed them. But it helps to know the foundation. This is a show built on real people, in real time, reacting to a real world. And that's where the accuracy comes from. This one might be my favorite in the whole lot. Not because it's the most dramatic revelation or the most impressive prediction, but because of how long it took to get there, and because of what it means when you actually sit with it. For the first several seasons of South Park, Kenny dying was a joke, a recurring one of the show's most recognizable running gags. He would die in some horrible way in nearly every episode. Run over, exploded, eaten, crushed, electrocuted, consumed by something that shouldn't have been able to consume him. And the next episode would begin with Kenny alive again, back at the bus stop. And nobody would acknowledge that anything had happened. Stan and Kyle's reactions became catchphrases. "Oh my God, they killed Kenny. You bastards." The audience laughed, the show moved on, and it happened again the next week. What fans started to notice fairly early on was that the deaths weren't entirely random. Kenny would sometimes react to what was happening to him with a kind of awareness that didn't fit the joke framing. There would be moments, small ones, easy to miss, where it seemed like Kenny knew something was coming, like he had seen this before. And there was the obvious question that the show let sit unanswered for years. Where exactly does he go when he dies? Does he remember any of it? Is there a Kenny McCormick who is aware on some level of everything that keeps happening to him? The fan theory that developed around this was that Kenny wasn't just a comic device. He was a genuine supernatural entity, or at least a genuinely cursed one. The theory held that Kenny's deaths were real, that he experienced each one fully and consciously, that he remembered everything, and that his resurrection the following episode wasn't a reset in the way the show's tone implied. The reset was just how it looked from the outside. On the inside, Kenny was accumulating every single death, carrying the memory of all of it, and being unable to do anything about it or tell anyone. That theory sat in the fandom for years before the show addressed it. And then in 2010, in a trilogy of episodes called the Coon and Friends arc, which sounds like it should be a lighthearted superhero parody and partly is, the show confirmed nearly all of it, not in a throwaway line, not as a joke, as actual canon. The Coon and Friends arc, which spans Coon 2, Hindsight, Mysterion Rises, and Coon vs. Coon and Friends in Season 14, reveals that Kenny has a superhero alter ego called Mysterion, whose power is that he cannot permanently die. He dies and he wakes up, over and over. And in Mysterion Rises, Kenny, speaking in his own voice, which you could actually understand, which was itself a departure from the muffled hood, breaks down and tells the group about what his immortality is actually like. He has no idea why it keeps happening. He has tried to explain it to his parents and they don't believe him. He dies and he comes back and nobody remembers. And he has been living with this his entire life with no explanation and no one to talk to about it. Here's the thing. That scene is genuinely sad in the middle of a superhero parody arc. In an episode that also features Cartman being absolutely insufferable in a raccoon costume, there is a scene of quiet, real anguish about what it means to be Kenny. And it confirms that the fans who said he was experiencing those deaths consciously were right. The explanation for the immortality comes in the same arc. Kenny's parents attended a meeting of a cult devoted to Cthulhu when his mother was pregnant with him. They went because there was free beer. The cult's ritual, whatever it did to the area or the people in it, resulted in Kenny being born unable to permanently die, which is honestly the most South Park reason I can possibly imagine. But here's what makes this more than just a funny reveal. The theory that fans had built up over years wasn't just that Kenny was immortal. It was that his immortality was a specific kind of horror, not a superpower, not a gift, a punishment that he didn't ask for and cannot escape, inflicted on him before he was even born because his parents went to a cult meeting for free beer. And the show confirmed that exactly. What gets me about this one is the accumulated weight of it when you go back and watch the early episodes. All those deaths that everyone laughed at, and they are funny, I'm not going to pretend they aren't, are also retroactively episodes in the life of a kid who was fully aware of what was happening to him and had no way to stop it or explain it to anyone. The comedy didn't go away, but a layer of something else was always underneath it. And the fans found it years before the show bothered to confirm it. There's also a secondary element to the Kenny mythology that gets less attention but is worth mentioning. Because Mysterion is Mysterion, Kenny's alter ego, his immortality is the foundation of the character, and fans had theorized for years before the arc that Mysterion was almost certainly Kenny. The clues were in the show, scattered across multiple seasons if you were paying attention to certain details about the character's behavior and the way certain other characters reacted to him. By the time the show confirmed it, the theory community had essentially closed the case long before the verdict came in. That's not reading too much into things. That's a show leaving breadcrumbs and a fandom careful enough to follow them. The loneliness of it is what stays with me, honestly. Not the supernatural mechanics of the whole thing. Not the Cthulhu connection, as darkly funny as that is. Just the image of a small kid in an orange parka who has died more times than he can count, who has tried to explain this to the people closest to him, and who just has to keep showing up at the bus stop the next morning because what else is he going to do? That's the real theory the fandom confirmed. That underneath the joke was a tragedy, and the show was waiting for the right moment to admit it. If you were watching South Park in real time in 1997 and 1998, you lived through what is, I think, one of the most genuinely audacious things an animated comedy has ever done to its audience. And the theory that fans eventually built around it turned out to be exactly right, which meant the fans were correct about something the show had spent considerable effort making you not want to think too hard about. The first season of South Park ended on a cliffhanger. The episode was called Cartman's Mom is a Dirty Slut, which is exactly the kind of title that announces its intentions very clearly. The plot followed the boys trying to determine who Eric Cartman's father was, given that his mother, Leanne, had apparently been somewhat indiscriminate at a drunken barn dance several years prior. By the end of the episode, they were on the verge of finding out, and then the credits rolled. That was in February 1998. Fans spent weeks anticipating the resolution. South Park was at the height of its cultural moment. This was the show that was on magazine covers, that everyone was talking about, that had become a genuine phenomenon in a way that's hard to fully remember now. The Season 2 premiere was a major event. People actually planned their evenings around it. And then the premiere aired, and it was an episode about Terrence and Philip. Not a single second of Cartman's paternity. Just Terrence and Philip, the fictional Canadian fart comedy duo that the boys watch on television within the show, doing their thing for the entire runtime. The backlash was immediate and significant. Viewers were genuinely furious. The response online, And this was still the relatively early days of the internet being a place where television discourse happened, was not mild. People felt legitimately deceived. It's the kind of thing that now we'd recognize as a trolling masterpiece. At the time, people were just angry. Parker and Stone later admitted this was entirely intentional. They thought it was funny. They had also been dealing with a significant amount of external pressure from the show's sudden fame and wanted to do something that was essentially the opposite of what everyone wanted, which is very much how they operate. The actual resolution came the following week, and it brought us to the theory. The fan theory, which had been circulating for a while in the nascent South Park online community, was that the answer to Cartman's paternity was going to be more complicated than simply naming a man at the drunken barn dance. Some fans had noticed certain things about how Leanne Cartman was written, certain details about her character that didn't quite add up in the way they would if she were straightforwardly what she appeared to be. The theory, indeed, and it was a fairly bold one to arrive at from the available evidence, was that Leanne Cartman was herself Cartman's father. That Leanne Cartman was a hermaphrodite. That's what the show confirmed. Cartman's mother is also his father in the specific biological sense that she fathered him. Leanne Cartman is a hermaphrodite, and no one else at the drunken barn dance needs to be identified because there is only one person responsible. The show played this for laughs. It's still South Park. But the reveal had a genuine dramatic logic to it that I think is underappreciated, because it doesn't just answer the paternity question. It reframes Cartman's entire character in a slightly different light. Here's a kid who, at a fundamental level, cannot trace his own origins in any conventional way, who grows up with a mother who is, in one specific sense, the only parent he has, and who has every external indicator of being cared for and indulged while also being, internally, a person building elaborate walls around a self he doesn't entirely know how to locate. Cartman's cruelty, his need for control, his obsessive relationship with power and validation. The show never makes these things sympathetic, but they have a root, and the root is right there in the season 2 premiere, hiding behind the Terrence and Philip episode they made you sit through first. The fans who got this right deserve some credit, not because it was an obvious reading, it wasn't, but because they were doing something the show rewards in general, which is paying attention to the details that seem incidental. Leanne Cartman's character in the first season contained clues that were easy to dismiss as just the show being random and strange. They weren't random, they were building towards something. And a small number of viewers followed the thread all the way to the right answer before the show ever told them. There's a footnote to this that I find quite delightful. Because of the Terrence and Philip episode, because of how deliberately Parker and Stone baited and then frustrated the audience's expectations, the actual resolution, when it came, was almost secondary to the experience of being messed with. The show had, in the process of answering its own cliffhanger, also made a fairly clear statement about the relationship between fan expectation and creative control, which is, now that I think about it, a theme they would return to many times in later seasons in considerably more elaborate ways. But that's a whole other evening. In September 2013, South Park aired the 17th season premiere, an episode called Let Go, Let Gov. The episode follows Cartman becoming convinced that the NSA is monitoring everything he does. He infiltrates the agency disguised as Bill Clinton, gets himself hired, discovers that the surveillance apparatus is real and vast and connected to a confined Santa Claus who serves as a kind of information processing hub, and then tries to expose all of this to the public. Nobody cares. That last part is the point. Cartman's big reveal lands to a collective shrug. The public is not particularly troubled by the information that their government has been watching them. People have already, by this point in the episode's internal logic, made a kind of unconscious peace with the idea that their lives are being monitored. Cartman is devastated, not because he was wrong, but because being right turns out not to matter. Now, here's the context. Edward Snowden had leaked the classified documents revealing the NSA's mass surveillance programs in June 2013. This was 3 months before Let Go, Let Gov aired, So the show wasn't predicting the surveillance revelation, it was responding to it, which fits the production cycle we talked about earlier. But the theory element, the part that fans had been building toward for a while before any of this happened, was less about the surveillance itself and more about what the public response would be. There had been in the South Park fan community a long-running argument about what the show was actually saying about the relationship between citizens and the state. Across multiple episodes, across multiple seasons, the show had built a picture of a public that is extraordinarily easy to manage. Adults in South Park are reliably susceptible to institutional authority, to media manipulation, to collective hysteria. They panic about things that don't matter and ignore things that do. And there was a theory, not one theory with a single author, more like a consensus that formed gradually, that South Park was describing something true about how power actually works in modern democracies. That the systems most worth fearing are the ones people have already decided to accept. Let Go, Let Gov confirmed that reading directly. The episode's target wasn't the NSA's surveillance. The episode's target was the fact that the surveillance's existence, once known, didn't change anything. People went back to their lives. The monitoring continued. The show had predicted, or at least articulated early, that the Snowden revelations would not produce the sustained public outrage that many people assumed they would. And they didn't, really. There was a period of significant news coverage. There were congressional hearings. There were op-eds about the erosion of privacy, and then most of it receded. The surveillance infrastructure largely continued. The public discussion moved on to other things. The story that Cartman couldn't get anyone to care about in September 2013 turned out to be an accurate forecast of how the real version of that story played out over the following years. There's a subplot in the episode that I think is actually more interesting than the main Cartman storyline, and which gets less attention. Butters, who misunderstands Cartman's paranoia, doesn't fear the government at all. He's comforted by the idea that they're watching. He starts going to the Department of Motor Vehicles to confess his perceived sins to government workers, treating the state as a kind of benevolent deity that knows everything and will keep him safe. It's absurd. It's also a fairly precise description of a real psychological dynamic, the way that surveillance can be internalized not as a threat, but as a reassurance. The idea that being watched means someone is paying attention, that there is an authority that cares enough to monitor you. Parker and Stone were describing something that social psychologists would later have a lot to say about in the context of data collection, social media, and the voluntary disclosure of personal information. The joke in the episode is that Butters is being ridiculous. The more uncomfortable rating is that Butters is being very human. One more thing about this one. The episode aired, remember, a few months after Snowden, which means Parker and Stone processed the Snowden leaks and wrote an episode that was less about the moral horror of mass surveillance and more about the public's relationship to that horror in about 6 days. And the take they landed on in those 6 days was, in retrospect, more accurate than a great deal of the commentary that appeared in more formal venues over the following months. That's the show's production cycle doing something that's actually quite rare, moving fast enough to get to the real question before the slower-moving discourse had even finished debating the obvious one. This one is a bit different from the others because it's not a single prediction. It's more like the show quietly tracked an entire cultural transformation across multiple seasons, from fringe workaround to full normalization to corporate commodification, and got each stage right before each stage arrived, which is impressive in a different way. Getting a single moment right is lucky. Getting an entire 10-year arc right in sequence starts to feel like something else. Let's start in 2010. South Park's 14th season included an episode called Medicinal Fried Chicken, which follows Cartman and the boys discovering that the local KFC has been replaced by a medical marijuana dispensary. This was a genuine thing happening in Colorado at the time. The state had passed a medical cannabis law back in 2000, and by 2010, dispensaries were proliferating in certain areas in ways that were, to some residents, a bit startling. The episode played this as satire. Randy Marsh deliberately gives himself testicular cancer so that he can qualify for a medical marijuana card. The image of Randy navigating this workaround, going through the legitimate medical apparatus to access something that everyone understood was, in practice, recreational, was the joke. And it was a funny joke. But it was also an accurate description of exactly how the medical marijuana system was operating in Colorado at the time. People were using it for legitimate medical purposes. People were also absolutely using it as a workaround for recreational use, while the recreational use laws hadn't caught up yet. The dispensary system was simultaneously a genuine medical resource and, in practice, a semi-official recreational marketplace. The show saw this clearly in 2010 and played it for comedy. Colorado's Amendment 64, which made recreational cannabis fully legal for adults, passed in November 2012, 2 years after a medicinal fried chicken. The thing the episode was satirizing as a slightly absurd workaround became the official law of the state, and then the show kept going. Season 22, which aired in 2018, introduced Integrity Farms. Randy Marsh, after years of being a geologist and a town embarrassment and various other things, becomes a cannabis farmer. He moves the family to the country, starts growing weed commercially, and spends the season navigating the reality of the legal Colorado marijuana industry. The competition, the branding decisions, the tension between small farms and larger commercial operations, the question of whether getting into the industry for idealistic reasons is compatible with the commercial realities of staying in it. The Integrity Farms era is, among South Park fans, somewhat divisive. Some people think it took over too much of the show. Some people love it, but as a piece of observation, it's quite precise. By 2018, Colorado's cannabis industry had gone through exactly that arc. From the illicit and the semi-illicit to the medical workaround, to the legal recreational market, to the full commercial ecosystem, with all the branding and competition and lifestyle identity that comes with it. The show followed the whole thing in real time across 8 years of seasons. Here's the thing that makes the Randy Marsh angle particularly interesting. Randy in the Integrity Farms storyline doesn't become a weed farmer because he's principled. He does it because he wants to get high and has figured out a way to make that someone else's problem. He frames it in the language of integrity and independence. Integrity is his invented brand name, a portmanteau of integrity, or while his actual motivations are transparently self-serving. The branding contradicts the reality in a way that Randy is either entirely unaware of or entirely comfortable with. And that dynamic, the gap between the language people use about cannabis culture and the actual reasons they engage with it, is something that the show had been circling since Medicinal Fried Chicken. The medical necessity framing wasn't always dishonest, but it was often a convenient story. The Integrity Farms integrity framing isn't always dishonest either, but it's also often a convenient story. The show tracked how the language around cannabis kept shifting to fit the current social acceptability of the thing itself, while the thing itself stayed largely the same. That's a pretty sophisticated piece of cultural observation to pull off across a decade of episodic television. And they did it without ever writing a serious episode about it. Just a geologist who wanted to get stoned and kept upgrading his justifications. Let me take a breath here, actually, and give you a moment too. We've covered quite a bit. If you've been following along, just take a second. Settle into wherever you are. If your eyes are getting heavy, that's completely fine. But I do want to get to this one because it's one of the clearest examples of the show calling something correctly and then getting punished for it in real time. Banned in China aired in October 2019. It's a season 23 episode in which Randy Marsh travels to China to expand the Integrity Farms marijuana business and encounters the Chinese government's censorship apparatus while trying to operate there. Simultaneously, Stan and the other boys are adapting a movie version of their lives, and the studio that picks it up is forced to keep revising the film to make it acceptable to the Chinese market, removing anything that might offend Beijing, softening any content that portrays China critically, making the film progressively less like what it was supposed to be. The episode was a direct, explicit satire of Hollywood studios self-censoring their films and their streaming content to maintain or gain access to the Chinese market. This had been happening for years. Studios adjusting scripts, removing scenes, casting decisions being made with an eye toward Chinese box office potential. Entire storylines reworked to ensure the film could be approved for Chinese distribution. Most of the discourse about it in mainstream media was polite and somewhat oblique. South Park was not polite or oblique about it. The Chinese government removed all South Park content, episodes, clips, social media discussions, from the Chinese internet within days of the episode airing. Official responses called it vulgar and said it smeared China. Trey Parker and Matt Stone issued a statement that was, in the tradition of their work, not particularly conciliatory. What the episode got right and what the band confirmed was something the fan community had been analyzing for a while before the episode made it explicit. Across multiple seasons, the show had been building a consistent argument about how the entertainment industry responds to large markets that have significant restrictions on content. Not just China, though China was the most prominent example. The argument was that commercial pressure consistently wins over creative or political principle, that studios and distributors will modify their content to access audiences with money rather than accept the cost of standing on principle, and that this process happens gradually and somewhat invisibly because each individual concession is small enough to rationalize. Banned in China put that argument in the form of Stan's movie, which starts as something honest and becomes something else through a series of incremental accommodations. Each change makes sense in isolation. The cumulative result is a film that has nothing to do with what it was supposed to be. The ban itself was the show's argument confirmed. The Chinese government's reaction to being described accurately was to remove the description, which is, in a strange way, the most effective possible evidence that the description was accurate. There's an older episode that connects directly to this same argument. Awesome-o, which gets its own section later. But the short version is that Parker and Stone were describing the incentive structure of studio development years before any AI tool existed to serve it. The tools change. The logic doesn't. The Magic Bush aired in October 2014. The episode follows Randy Marsh using a neighbor's drone, which he borrows without permission, to spy through another neighbor's window. The footage captures something compromising. The footage spreads. Other residents start using their own drones to surveil each other. The situation escalates until the government deploys military drones to manage the civilian drone problem, which creates its own set of problems that then require more intervention, in the familiar South Park pattern of every attempted solution making things considerably worse. At the time, personal drones were a genuinely new consumer product. Quadcopter drones had become commercially available to the general public relatively recently. They were being discussed mostly in positive terms: aerial photography, recreational use, potential delivery applications, the novelty of having a camera in the sky that you owned. The idea of a consumer drone as primarily a surveillance tool or as something that would create significant social and legal problems within neighborhoods was not yet the dominant conversation. By 2017 and 2018, it was. Drone-related privacy incidents had become a documented and litigated issue. People were being filmed in their gardens, near their windows, in spaces they had reasonable expectations of privacy. In December 2018, drone activity near Heathrow Airport caused significant disruption, shutting down flight operations and stranding passengers. A demonstration that the civilian drone problem had moved well beyond backyard disputes into genuine infrastructure vulnerability. The episode had described the mechanism exactly. Not the specific outcomes, but the mechanism, the way that a technology that seems innocuous or positive in individual hands becomes a collective problem when everyone has it simultaneously. One person with a drone is a hobbyist. A neighborhood of people with drones, all with slightly different ideas about what constitutes reasonable use, is a privacy crisis. The show understood this dynamic in 2014, while the public conversation was still largely focused on the fun parts. There's a broader point here about what the show does well with technology episodes. South Park is not particularly interested in technology as technology. It doesn't do what if this gadget existed speculation. What it consistently does well is identify the social behavior that a new technology is likely to enable or amplify, and specifically the social behavior that people would prefer not to acknowledge because it's not flattering. Drones didn't make people want to surveil each other. The desire was already there. Drones just made it easy, cheap, and deniable. The magic bush understood this, that the interesting question about consumer drones wasn't what they could do, but what people would use them for once social inhibition was removed and the barrier to entry was low enough. And the answer, as the show suggested in 2014 and as subsequent years confirmed, was to watch each other. Not out of malice necessarily, just out of curiosity and access, and the specific kind of permission that technology grants by virtue of existing. There's a fan theory connected to this, a broader one about the show's technology episodes, that goes something like this. South Park is consistently most accurate about technology when it ignores the technology and focuses on the people using it. Make Love Not Warcraft isn't really about World of Warcraft. It's about a specific kind of obsessive personality that certain game structures enable, and about what friendship looks like when it's organized around a shared obsession. You Have Zero Friends isn't really about Facebook. It's about social validation and the way digital popularity systems interact with people who are already insecure about belonging. The Magic Bush isn't really about drones. It's about the gap between how people describe their intentions with new technology and what they actually use it for when nobody is watching. Which is ironic given that the whole episode is about people watching each other with flying cameras. Is this theory confirmed? No. Has it ever been denied? Also no. But if you watch all three of those episodes back to back, it's hard to argue that the technology isn't secondary. The people are always the story. Season 19 aired in 2015. When it was announced that PC Principal, a new character who would arrive at South Park Elementary and begin aggressively enforcing politically correct language and behavior, was going to be introduced, a lot of the initial reaction in the fan community was defensive. People assumed the show was going to do a straightforward parody, mock political correctness, defend the show's own history of offensive content, take the easy route. What season 19 actually did was considerably stranger, and I think more interesting. The theory that had been circulating before season 19, before PC Principal existed, was that the show was eventually going to have to confront its own position in the culture. 20 years of deliberately offensive material in a media environment that was rapidly changing around it. The theory argued that the show couldn't keep doing what it had always done without eventually addressing what it had always done. That the silence on this was itself a kind of position, and that positions can't be held indefinitely. Season 19 addressed it, but not by defending the show's history and not by apologizing for it. It did something more structurally interesting, which was to analyze how the mechanism of ideological enforcement works. Not the ideology, the mechanism. What PC Principal embodies is not political correctness as a value. What he embodies is the institutional enforcement of values in ways that become disconnected from the values themselves. The show distinguishes carefully and consistently across the season between genuinely caring about treating people decently and performing the appearance of caring about treating people decently as a form of social positioning. Stunning and brave, while the season 19 premiere introduces PC Principal physically beating up Cartman for using problematic language. This is played as partly horrifying and partly, in the show's logic, funny. But it's not a simple endorsement or a simple condemnation. It's a description of something the show had been observing, the way that legitimate values can be adopted and operationalized by people who are more interested in the performance of those values than in their actual content. And the show then follows this through the entire season, which builds into something fairly elaborate about how systems of enforcement tend to serve the people doing the enforcing. 5 or 6 years later, the conversation the show was trying to have in 2015 had become the mainstream conversation. The terms had changed, but the underlying questions about the difference between genuine ethical commitments and their performative expression, about who benefits from enforcement cultures, and how about what happens when the mechanism outlasts the original purpose, were exactly the questions that were being debated everywhere. The fan community's theory that the show would eventually address its own cultural position was right, though the form the address took was different from what most people expected. The show didn't defend itself or apologize. It analyzed the argument, which is honestly probably the most South Park approach possible. But season 19 also gave us member berries, and member berries deserve a moment of their own. Member berries are small purple fruits that, when eaten, cause people to reminisce nostalgically about things from their past. Remember Chewbacca? Remember the Ghostbusters? They're irresistibly compelling and impossible to stop consuming. They also, as the season develops, turn out to be politically manipulative. Their nostalgia habit makes people susceptible to a political appeal organized around returning to a simpler, better, imagined past. Season 19 aired in 2015. The member berry storyline continued into season 20, which aired in 2016, the same year as Brexit, the same year as the American election that elevated Donald Trump, whose campaign was explicitly organized around nostalgic rhetoric. Make America Great Again is a statement about the past, not the future. Is this a confirmed prediction? No. Parker and Stone were clearly responding to political trends they could already observe in 2015 and 2016. But the member berry as a metaphor for nostalgia as a political drug, for the specific vulnerability that nostalgia creates in people who are then available to be organized around an imagined better past, was a piece of cultural analysis that landed with unusual precision relative to what was actually happening around it. And the detail that the member berries are not just nostalgic but controlling, that they whisper in your ear, that you can't stop eating them, that their appeal is in the repetition and the comfort and the familiarity, captures something specific about how nostalgia-based political movements actually work. Not through argument or evidence, through the reliable pleasure of remembering things as better than they were, offered over and over until the memory is more real than the present. The fan theory community had been arguing before all of this that South Park was building a picture of a public mind that was more manipulable than it appeared, that the adults in this show were not just comic foils. They were a consistent portrait of how actual human cognition responds to emotional and nostalgic appeals versus rational ones. Member berries confirmed that reading explicitly, and then the world confirmed it outside the show. The pandemic special aired on Comedy Central on October 1st, 2020, 7 months into COVID-19. It was South Park's first long-form special, about 45 minutes, and it addressed the pandemic in the way the show addresses things, which is to say directly and without particular diplomatic softening. In the special, Randy Marsh's activities at Tegrity Farms turn out to be connected to the pandemic's origin. This part of the episode arrived in the middle of an ongoing real-world debate about how COVID-19 actually started, which meant a Bat and Randy connection was already landing in charged territory. The episode simultaneously dealt with remote learning, economic disruption, police reform protests, all happening concurrently in October 2020 in both the episode's Colorado and in the actual world. The show's timing in this case was less predictive and more simply current. It was doing what it does, responding to the moment as fast as possible. But here's the part that I find more interesting, and it involves going back much further. In 2008, 12 years before the pandemic, South Park aired an episode called Pandemic. In this episode, a worldwide crisis unfolds, driven by giant guinea pigs. The specifics are obviously completely different from COVID-19. Giant guinea pigs are not a respiratory virus, but the structure of the crisis in Pandemic is worth looking at. The government's response is chaotic, internally contradictory, and organized more around managing perceptions than managing the actual problem. Public figures make contradictory statements. The news media escalates the emotional stakes without providing clarity. Ordinary people panic in ways that are simultaneously understandable and counterproductive. Institutional trust collapses not primarily because the institutions fail, but because their failure is visibly uncoordinated. That's not a description of giant guinea pigs. That's a description of how a particular kind of crisis, one that is genuinely uncertain, that unfolds faster than institutional response mechanisms are designed for, that requires coordinated public behavior that those institutions are not good at producing, plays out in modern democracies, and it maps fairly precisely onto what actually happened in 2020. The fan theory that had developed around Pandemic and its 2009 follow-up, Pandemic 2, the startling was not really about disease, it was about institutional failure as a recurring theme in South Park. The consistent argument that official structures for managing crises are less good at managing crises than they are at managing how the crises appear. The theory held that South Park was making a coherent argument about institutional competence that was more serious than the guinea pig packaging made it look. When COVID-19 arrived and the Pandemic special aired, the guinea pig episodes acquired new relevance. Not because they predicted a respiratory pandemic, but because the failure mode they described, the chaotic, contradictory, optics-driven institutional response, was the exact failure mode that played out in 2020 across multiple governments and health organizations. There's one specific detail in the 2020 special that's worth noting separately, because it's the kind of thing that sounds too neat to be real but is documented. The Randy as Pandemic origin plotline, in which his activities in China are connected to how the virus spreads, arrived while the debate about COVID-19's geographic origin was actively unresolved and politically charged. Parker and Stone were clearly playing with something that was genuinely uncertain and genuinely controversial in October 2020. The show has always been comfortable standing in that uncertainty and making something from it, which is different from most media's instinct to resolve the uncertainty before touching it. What the 2020 special got right, beyond the specific references to remote learning and economic disruption and racial justice protests, was the texture of that particular moment. The sense of everyone adjusting to something unprecedented while simultaneously fighting about everything else. The exhaustion, the way that a genuine collective crisis became immediately fractured into separate ideological arguments. The show caught that in real time and, as usual, was willing to say things about it that more cautious approaches were still dancing around. The broader theory the 2008 and 2009 episodes support, that South Park has been consistently more accurate about how institutions behave in crises than it is given credit for, is one I find quite hard to argue with. The specific content is always absurd. The underlying observation is usually fairly precise. Osimo is probably in most people's top 10 episodes, possibly top 5. It follows Cartman disguising himself as a robot, a remarkably unconvincing robot, essentially just Cartman in a cardboard box, in order to trick Butters into sharing an embarrassing video that Cartman can use to humiliate him. It's a Butters and Cartman episode at its core, which means it's anchored in one of the show's best character dynamics. Cartman trying to maintain a deception, Butters being genuine about everything in a way that makes the deception both easier and more devastating. The part that turned out to matter came from a subplot. A movie studio discovers Osimo and decides to use the supposed robot to generate film pitches. Cartman, trapped in his own disguise, starts spitting out concepts. He generates approximately 800 ideas involving Adam Sandler in a romantic comedy situation. Each one slightly different from the last, all essentially the same film. The studio executives receive each pitch with enthusiasm. They don't want originality, they want volume and predictability and the comfort of a familiar formula. The robot is useful to them precisely because it doesn't have opinions or aesthetic preferences, it just generates. This episode aired in 2004. In 2020, Warner Brothers announced it was investing in an AI system to analyze scripts and estimate their box office potential. Other studios followed. By the early 2020s, AI was being used across the industry for concept generation, audience response testing, greenlighting evaluation, and various other functions that had previously been done by humans with opinions. The joke that Awasimo made in 2004, that studios would happily use a content-generating machine if one existed because the machine could produce what they wanted faster and without the inconvenient complication of having aesthetic preferences, had become, in meaningful ways, the actual situation. What gets me about this one isn't the AI element specifically. Parker and Stone weren't predicting AI. They were describing the incentive structure that AI would later serve. The episode's real insight is about what studios actually want from their creative process, which is not creativity, it's reliable output in a format they already know works. The machine is good for them not because it's smarter than humans, but because it's cheaper and faster at generating variations on existing patterns. And that's more or less what AI tools in Hollywood have been good for. Not for inventing new things, but for producing iterations of things that have already worked. Osimo understood that the machine would be welcomed, not despite its limitations, but because of them. There's a separate prediction in the same episode that's smaller, but quite satisfying. Butters mentions in passing that he doesn't play World of Warcraft and prefers a game called Hello Kitty Island Adventure. This game did not exist. In 2008, a comparable game called Hello Kitty Online launched. And on April Fool's Day of that year, the game made a direct reference to the show's fictional version with an announcement about an island adventure expansion. Fiction became reality, then reality winked at fiction. It's a small loop, but it's a pleasing one. The broader fan theory about this episode and about Athenia they announced, and about the show's treatment of entertainment industry episodes generally, is that South Park has a consistent read on the creative industries that is less about technology and more about the fundamental tension between art as self-expression and art as commercial product. Across many episodes, across many years, the show keeps returning to this, that the systems through which creative work gets made and distributed tend to deform the work toward commercial viability, and that the people who operate those systems are usually more comfortable with that process than they let on. The studios in South Park are always basically the same. They want what has worked before. They're anxious about novelty. They'll embrace any tool that reduces uncertainty. And they'll frame all of this consistently in the language of supporting creative vision while doing the opposite. Is this confirmed as a deliberate thematic argument? Parker and Stone would probably deny it's that systematic, but it's there across enough episodes, across enough seasons, that whether it was conscious or not, it represents something the show understood about how entertainment actually works. And the arrival of AI tools in Hollywood didn't change that understanding. It just provided the show's long-running observation with its most literal and visible example. Britney's New Look aired in March 2008. It's not a comfortable episode. I want to say that clearly before describing it, because some episodes are uncomfortable for the wrong reasons, and this one is uncomfortable for the right ones. The premise is that the boys pursue Britney Spears, who is hiding from the paparazzi, by tricking their way into her hotel room. She finds them there and believes she's been caught by intruders and fires a shotgun. Missing the boys and shooting off most of her own head, she survives, partially. She spends the rest of the episode trying to recover while the media continues hounding her, photographing her in degrading situations, distributing the images, and generating escalating coverage. The more damaged she becomes, the more coverage she generates, and the more coverage she generates, the more damage follows. By the end of the episode, Britney has been reduced to something barely recognizable, and the crowd moves on. A brief announcement indicates that their next target is Miley Cyrus. The episode ends. Now, in 2008, Britney Spears was in the middle of a very public personal crisis. The shaved head, the paparazzi collapse, the custody battles, all of it was happening in real time. South Park was reacting to something already underway. But the episode wasn't really about Britney Spears specifically. What it was describing, and what the fan theory community had been articulating about the show's celebrity episodes for years before this one, was the mechanism, not the specific case, the mechanism. The theory went like this. South Park had been making a consistent argument across its celebrity episodes that the media ecosystem is not primarily in the business of covering famous people. It's in the business of consuming them. The coverage isn't a consequence of public interest, it's the cause of it. The media creates the appetite for a particular kind of story: decline, instability, spectacle, degradation, and then produces the content that satisfies that appetite. Celebrities are not the subjects of this process. They're the material, and the prediction embedded in Britney's new look that the crowd would simply move on to the next target, that Miley Cyrus would be next, was not a specific forecast about Miley Cyrus's life. It was a claim about how the system works, that there is always a next target, that the mechanism requires continuous feeding, that the specific person being consumed is interchangeable, and that the moment one person is no longer sufficiently consumable, another takes their place. The years following 2008 confirm this in considerable detail. Miley Cyrus's arc through the tabloid media, particularly around 2013, followed the exact pattern the episode described. A young female celebrity whose public image became organized around a decline narrative that the media simultaneously reported on and accelerated, generating enormous engagement in the process. The details were different. The mechanism was the same. What makes the episode more than just a fairly pointed satire of tabloid culture is where the moral responsibility lands. South Park characteristically doesn't put all the blame on the media. The crowd in the episode, the public consuming the coverage, is implicated, not villainized exactly, but not absolved either. The show's argument is that the media's appetite for this kind of content exists because there's a public appetite for it. That we, as consumers of media, are more complicit in what the media does than we'd like to admit. This is a more uncomfortable argument than blaming the paparazzi or the editors. And the fan community had been making it about South Park's celebrity episodes for years before Britney's new look made it explicit. The theory was that the show's relentless mockery of celebrities was always actually a two-target enterprise. The celebrity and the audience watching them be mocked. That the show was aware of the dynamic it was participating in and was trying to implicate the viewer in it. Whether that's the right reading of every celebrity episode is debatable. But for Britney's new look specifically, the episode earns that reading. It ends with the crowd moving on, intact and untroubled, looking for the next target. And the fact that this happened, more or less exactly as described with Miley Cyrus and later with others, is hard to set aside. There's a particular kind of loneliness in that episode that I don't think gets talked about enough. Not for Britney specifically, for the person in that position generally. The show strips away everything, the talent, the celebrity, the cultural relevance, and shows you what remains when the machine is done with someone. And what remains is very small. The crowd doesn't notice. They've already moved on. I don't know. That one stays with me. The Passion of the Jew aired in March 2004. The premise involves Kyle, who is Jewish, being shaken in his faith after watching Mel Gibson's then recently released film, The Passion of the Christ, which was a genuine cultural phenomenon at the time. A controversial, graphic depiction of Christ's crucifixion that generated enormous discussion about its religious meaning, its cinematic value, and its portrayal of Jewish characters in relation to the crucifixion narrative. Cartman characteristically decides to use the film's imagery for his own purposes and forms a Mel Gibson fan club that trends in a direction Cartman would find natural. Meanwhile, Stan and Kenny go to Mel Gibson's mansion to get their money back because they thought the film was bad and they want a refund. This seems straightforward. What they find at the mansion is not straightforward. The Mel Gibson in this episode is a religious extremist who uses his Christianity as a cover for something considerably more unhinged. He's obsessed with being tortured and humiliated. He's manipulative, volatile, and makes statements about Jewish people that the episode presents as both horrifying and clearly believed by the character. He is, in the most precise sense the show could manage while still being a cartoon, a portrait of a person whose religious conviction is intertwined with something darker that it provides cover for. That was in 2004. In July 2006, Mel Gibson was arrested for drunk driving in Malibu. During the arrest, he told the arresting officers that Jews are responsible for all the wars in the world. He made several other anti-Semitic statements during the incident. The arrest report leaked. The story became enormous. And the man who had 2 years earlier made one of the most expensive independently produced religious films in history turned out to have said, while not exercising tight control over his public face, almost exactly what the South Park episode had been satirizing. The episode was playing it as an absurdist caricature, a deliberately exaggerated version of a celebrity. The kind of escalated portrait that South Park always draws. Take the perceived truth about a person, amplify it to the point of absurdity, and build an episode around the amplified version. The usual assumption, is that the amplification is the joke, that the reality is more moderate than the cartoon. In this case, the cartoon turned out to be essentially accurate, not exaggerated, not a caricature of something that was actually more reasonable, just accurate. This is the example on this list that I find hardest to explain away as clever satire or fast production cycles or anything systematic. Parker and Stone had formed a specific view of Mel Gibson based on publicly available information. His religious statements, the content of The Passion, interviews he'd given, and translated that view into a cartoon character. And the cartoon character's core attribute, which was that the religious conviction was a vehicle for something uglier, was confirmed publicly 2 years later in Gibson's own words. I'm not saying this was prediction, I think it was perception, a careful reading of a person that turned out to be correct. But the gap between perception and prediction is smaller than it looks when the perception is this accurate. What's also worth noting is the Kyle storyline in the episode, which is easy to overlook in favor of the more dramatic Mel Gibson content. Kyle's crisis of faith after watching The Passion, his discomfort with a portrayal that seems to assign collective guilt to Jewish people for the crucifixion, addresses something real about the film's controversy that was being debated in more measured terms in various serious publications at the time. The episode didn't avoid the actual theological and political substance of the debate. It engaged with it while simultaneously deploying Mel Gibson as an unhinged cartoon antagonist, both things at once, which is honestly the thing South Park does that nobody else quite manages: hold two registers simultaneously, the absolutely ridiculous and the genuinely serious. And the fact that the ridiculous turned out to be accurate in this case makes the serious part land harder, retroactively. All right, take a breath. This one is going to feel a bit different from the others because this is the one that the show has never confirmed and has never denied, and which has sat in the fandom for years in that strange middle space where the evidence keeps accumulating and the resolution never comes. The theory is this: South Park, the town, is being used as a testing ground by some external organization, possibly government, possibly something more secretive, possibly, in the way these theories go, something that doesn't have a comfortable name. The organization has chosen this particular small Colorado mountain town to conduct experiments. Not scientific experiments exactly, social and supernatural ones. Scenarios are introduced into the town's environment: aliens, divine interventions, demonic presences, reality-bending events, and the responses are observed. The town is a laboratory. The residents are subjects who don't know they're subjects. The evidence for this theory, such as it is cumulative rather than decisive. No single event proves it, but the accumulation is genuinely strange if you choose to look at it that way. Start with the basic fact. South Park is a small town in Colorado, population unclear but small. And within the history of this small town, the following have occurred: alien abductions, multiple visitations from Satan, multiple direct encounters with God, a zombie outbreak, a visit from the actual Antichrist, a visit from Cthulhu, at least 3 occasions where the fabric of reality was visibly altered, a scenario in which the entire Earth was revealed to be a reality television program broadcast to an extraterrestrial audience, and various other events that would, in any normal world, be historically significant on a global scale. None of these events produces lasting change on the town. After each one, things return to something like normal. No one ages. Institutional memory is inconsistent. Characters who were profoundly affected by one event seem largely unaffected by it in subsequent episodes. The town absorbs each impossible thing and continues. The theory holds that this pattern is the concentration of the extraordinary in one location, the reset after each event, the absence of lasting consequences, is not a production inconsistency. It's the design. Something is watching. Something is running the study. The reset isn't arbitrary. It's methodology. Is this confirmed? No. Has it ever been denied? Also no. And here's where it gets interesting, because in season 7, there's an episode called Cancelled, which reveals that Earth is literally a reality television program being broadcast to alien audiences. Jusians, a species of alien media executives, set up Earth as a show and have been running it since the beginning of human history. The boys discover this and force the cancellation of the program to be reversed, protecting the Earth. The episode plays this as a one-off premise. The mythology never returns to it in the same direct way. But the fan theory community immediately recognized it as the closest the show had ever come to confirming the experimental nature reading. If Earth is a reality show, if human behavior has been curated and observed from the outside since the beginning, then the concentration of impossible events in South Park isn't an accident, it's programming. The producers want certain things to happen there because certain things happening there makes for good television. And the show, by never following up on this, neither confirmed nor denied the reading. The episode is just there in season 7 doing what South Park episodes do, stating something enormous as a premise, playing it out to its comedic conclusion, and then moving on as though it didn't matter. But it's there. The time loop element connects here as well. If Kenny's deaths are confirmed to create some kind of supernatural disturbance, and they are confirmed to be supernatural, then the question of whether those disturbances affect the fabric of time around South Park is not unreasonable. The characters in the show have been in 4th grade their entire run, perennially, stubbornly 9 years old. Not because Parker and Stone are lazy about continuity, but because the town doesn't age. The boys don't age. The world around them changes, elections happen, technology advances, and the kids at the bus stop are always 9. The time loop theory holds that Kenny's immortality is not just about Kenny, that each death causes a micro reset, that the cumulative effect of hundreds of resets over decades is a town that exists slightly outside normal temporal flow, that the experiment, whatever it is, requires a stable population, and the stability is maintained through mechanisms that nobody inside the experiment can perceive or measure. Is that what's happening? I have genuinely no idea. Parker and Stone would probably say no, or more likely say something considerably more profane and dismissive. But the fact that the theory maps so cleanly onto the show's actual continuity, not despite the inconsistencies but because of them, means it keeps surviving. Every season that ends with the boy still 9 years old is another data point. Every impossible event that leaves no trace is another data point. The evidence doesn't accumulate toward a conclusion. It accumulates toward a question that remains permanently open. And honestly, that might be what makes it the most satisfying theory on this list. The ones that get confirmed are interesting. But the one that sits there, permanently unresolved, mapping perfectly onto everything without ever being admitted, that's the theory that really sticks. This one is a bit different from the others because it's less about the world outside the show and more about what the show was building internally. And it's the theory I find most personally satisfying because it's one of those things that once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that retroactively reorganizes how you watch the early seasons. The theory, in its simplest form, Randy Marsh was always the true protagonist of South Park, not the boys. Not Stan, despite being Trey Parker's self-insert. Randy. The show just took most of its run to acknowledge it openly. This started as a minor fan observation in the middle seasons. Randy was showing up in more and more episodes. His subplots were getting more screen time. His character was becoming more developed and more complex. Not more likable necessarily, but more interesting, more fully realized. By season 9 or 10, there were already people arguing that the Randy episodes were consistently the most engaging episodes of any given season, and that this wasn't a coincidence. The evidence that was there from the early seasons, once you start looking for it, is fairly abundant. Randy Marsh, even in season 1 and season 2, was written with more interiority than the other adult characters. The other adults in South Park are mostly types. They're credulous, they're hysterical, they're susceptible to whatever the current episode requires them to be susceptible to. Randy is all of those things, but he's also clearly operating from a specific internal logic. He has desires. He has rationalizations for those desires. He has a self-image that is in consistent, visible tension with his actual behavior. He wants to be a good person and keeps being a bad one, not out of pure selfishness, but out of the gap between his self-conception and his actual capacity for the things a good person needs to do. The theory was that this was intentional, that Parker was writing Randy, even in the early seasons, as something more than a comic foil, that Randy was Trey Parker's most honest self-portrait. Not Stan, the kid who wants to do the right thing, but Randy, the adult who still wants to do the right thing and keeps finding reasons why the right thing is just slightly inconvenient right now. Trey Parker has said various things over the years that support this reading in interviews and in DVD commentaries. He's talked about Randy as the most creatively interesting character to write, as the character who gives him the most freedom, as the one where there's the least distance between the writer and the character, which, combined with the autobiographical nature of Stan, suggests that Randy is what the autobiographical self-portrait looks like when the self being portrayed is older and less idealized. And then season 22 arrived. Integrity Farms, Randy Marsh, fully and explicitly, as the primary protagonist of South Park. Episodes structured around his story. The boys as supporting characters in their own show. The shift was noticed, discussed, and debated. Some fans welcomed it, some found it jarring. But the fact of the shift was undeniable. The show's center of gravity had moved, not abruptly. In retrospect, it had been moving for years. The theory was confirmed not with a single moment, but with a season. And the confirmation reframed everything before it in the way the best theory confirmations do. not by introducing new information, but by revealing that the information had always been there. What the Randy theory is really about, I think, is something the show understood about its own development that it couldn't have articulated in 1997. The boys are a premise. 4 kids in a town where impossible things happen. That premise has an enormous amount of material in it, and the show has drawn on it for decades. But there's a limit to what 4 9-year-olds can carry as protagonist vehicles, because 9-year-olds, even cynical cartoon ones, can't fully embody the specific kind of failure the show is most interested in. The failure of a person who knows better, the failure of competence, the failure of good intentions meeting bad execution over and over with genuine surprise each time. Randy Marsh can carry that. He's an adult. He's educated, he has professional credentials, he has a family that depends on him and that he loves imperfectly in ways that are recognizable. And he keeps doing things that are obviously going to go wrong in ways that are completely predictable, surprised each time by the consequences that were visible from miles away. That's the real main character of South Park, not the kid who reacts to the world with bewildered moral clarity. The adult who creates the situations the kid is reacting to and has excellent reasons for all of it. The fan community got this right years before the show made it explicit, which is either a tribute to how clearly Parker had always been writing Randy, or evidence that the show was building toward this conclusion long before it arrived. Possibly both. There are a handful of predictions on this list that aren't big enough to carry their own full section, but are worth talking about together, because in aggregate they paint a picture. They're the smaller ones, the throwaway lines and brief satirical gestures that ended up being correct in ways the show probably didn't particularly mean as predictions, but which turned out to be anyway. Let me start with the one that I think deserves the most attention in this category. In season 4, 2000, South Park aired an episode called Chef Goes Nanners. The main storyline involves a dispute over the South Park town flag, which depicts a black person being hanged, and which half the town wants changed and half the town wants to preserve for historical reasons. It's an episode about Confederate iconography, essentially, and about the familiar argument structure that emerges whenever there's a push to retire offensive symbols. One side arguing for change on the grounds of dignity and basic decency, the other arguing for preservation on the grounds of history and tradition. The show doesn't come down cleanly on either side because it rarely does, but it dramatizes the argument structure very accurately. Within this episode, there's a throwaway line. One of the adult characters discussing whether offensive team names and mascots should be changed specifically mentions the Cleveland Indians. This was in 2000. The Cleveland Indians changed their team name to the Cleveland Guardians in 2021. 21 years after the episode raised it as a question. And it wasn't just the Indians. In a later episode called Go Fund Yourself from season 18, the show returned to this territory with the Washington Redskins specifically. An episode in which the boys acquire the trademark for the Redskins name, creating an extended satirical situation around the debate over the team's identity. In 2022, the Washington football team became the Washington Commanders, completing a renaming process they'd begun in 2020. The show raised both of these specific cases, and specifically long before either team changed, not as wild speculation, as natural extensions of a debate that was already ongoing but that mainstream sports culture was slow to act on. Parker and Stone could see where the argument was heading because they were applying fairly basic logic. If the argument that certain mascots are offensive is correct, and if most reasonable people eventually come to agree with it, then the teams using those mascots will eventually be under pressure to change. The changes were slow, they were also eventually inevitable. South Park said so in 2000 and 2014. Now, a few others that are worth a brief mention. Britney's new look ended, as we talked about earlier, with the crowd moving to Miley Cyrus, which was 2008 when Miley was Disney-era Hannah Montana. Miley Cyrus's transformation and the media cycle it generated, The VMA performance, the tabloid coverage, the entire twerking and controversy arc came in 2013. The episode had 5 years on it. In Chef's Chocolate Salty Balls, Ganj, Season 2, 1998, Cartman dismisses independent films as being about gay cowboys eating pudding. Brokeback Mountain, the critically acclaimed drama about gay cowboys, won multiple Oscars in 2006. There's no pudding, but it's a gay cowboy film. And it was an independent production that received precisely the kind of serious critical attention the episode was mocking as pretentious. That one was 7 years ahead. And then there's the Carnival Cruise episode. In Crème Fraîche from 2010, a news report within the episode describes passengers on a Carnival cruise saying the ship smelled like excrement. In 2013, the Carnival Triumph experienced a fire that disabled power and sanitation systems, leaving over 3,000 passengers stranded for days in genuinely grim conditions. The tabloid coverage described the ship extensively in terms of what had accumulated without functioning toilets. It became known inevitably as the poop cruise. South Park had described a Carnival cruise smelling like excrement 3 years earlier as a throwaway gag. None of these are stunning revelations on their own, but here's the thing. They keep happening, not once, not twice. Consistently, there are these moments where a joke or a passing reference or a satirical premise turns out to be describing something that hasn't happened yet but will, and the cumulative weight of them starts to feel like more than coincidence. What they share, I think, is a quality of observation. South Park's writers watch the world with a specific kind of attention, looking for the gap between what people say and what they do, between what institutions claim to be and what they actually are, between the stated justification for a thing and the real reason behind it. That quality of attention produces satire, but it also produces, incidentally, accuracy. Because the gaps between stated and actual tend to close eventually, usually in the direction the show identified. The Cleveland Indians said for years that the name was a tribute, not an insult. The Carnival Cruise Line maintained safety standards until it didn't. Miley Cyrus was America's sweetheart until the moment she wasn't. None of this required a crystal ball. It just required watching carefully and being willing to say what you saw. In 1999, South Park aired an episode called Chin Pokemon, which is a parody of Pokemon. In the episode, a Japanese company releases a line of toys called Chin Pokemon that become wildly popular with children. The adults try to resist, try to understand, try to engage, and fail entirely. The toys turn out to be part of a Japanese government plot to use the entertainment product to reprogram children's minds and recruit them as soldiers for an attack on Pearl Harbor. The adults eventually stop the craze by expressing enthusiasm for the toys themselves, which immediately destroys any child's interest in them. It's a very funny episode. It's also, underneath the parody, a description of something that the show would keep returning to over the following 2 decades in increasingly direct terms. The basic mechanism the episode is describing is this: a media product designed or at least structured to capture maximum attention spreads through a population of children rapidly. The speed of adoption is part of the appeal. Having it makes you part of something. Not having it excludes you from something. The adults don't understand it. Their attempts to engage with it are clumsy and make things worse. The children's relationship with the product is total and temporary. Absolute devotion followed by complete abandonment the moment the cultural signal changes. That's a description of Pokemon in 1999. But it's also a description of Farmville in 2009. It's a description of Angry Birds in 2010. It's a description of fidget spinners in 2017. It's a description of TikTok dances in 2020. It's a description of every platform-driven behavioral fad that has swept through populations in the last 25 years. The product changes. The mechanism stays the same. Attention capture, social proof, adoption speed, abandonment. The fan theory about Chin Pokemon and the broader body of South Park episodes about technology and fads holds that the show, very early, identified something specific about how attention works in a connected world. Not the individual technologies, the pattern, the way that certain product or content structures are optimized, intentionally or incidentally, to produce total adoption very quickly in certain populations, particularly young ones, and that this optimization tends to happen faster than any cultural, parental, or regulatory response can track. Season 10's Make Love, Not Warcraft extended this into online gaming specifically. The episode is often discussed as an accurate portrayal of MMORPG addiction, which it is. But it's also making the same argument Chin Pokemon made, that certain designed environments are specifically structured to produce compulsive engagement, that the people inside those environments lose perspective on the outside world, and that the adults responsible for noticing this are consistently too far behind the technology to intervene in any useful way. By the time social media had become the dominant form of this dynamic, a designed environment specifically optimized for maximum engagement is driving compulsive use, producing measurable psychological effects in adolescent users. South Park had been describing the mechanism for over a decade. You Have Zero Friends from season 14, 2010, addressed Facebook specifically. Kyle is pressured into joining, his account becomes a site of social validation seeking and comparison anxiety, and his virtual avatar literally takes over his life. This was in 2010. The academic and popular literature on social media's effects on adolescent mental health would not fully arrive in mainstream consciousness until roughly 2017 to 2019. The show was describing the effects before the literature existed, not because Parker and Stone had access to research that wasn't published yet, because they were watching the same behavior that researchers would eventually study, and they could see what it was doing to people. There's a darker version of the Chin Pokemon theory that I find compelling, even though I'm uncertain how intentional it is. The episode's villains are the toy company, which is using entertainment as a manipulation vector. But the manipulation only works because the product is genuinely appealing. The kids aren't being brainwashed against their will. They're being captured by something they actually enjoy, and the enjoyment is the mechanism of the capture. The adults can't explain why the kids shouldn't have it because the kids' enjoyment of it is real. That's the structure of basically every major platform and content addiction we've seen. The product is genuinely pleasurable. The pleasure is the mechanism. The manipulation is not in opposition to the enjoyment. It works through the enjoyment. You can't tell people to stop enjoying something they actually enjoy. You can only hope they get bored of it before it does lasting damage. South Park understood this in 1999. It kept understanding it. Across Warcraft episodes and Facebook episodes and social media satire, and the world kept catching up to it. Not because the show was predicting the specific products, but because the pattern it identified in 1999 turned out to be durable in ways that weren't obvious at the time. One last thing about Chin Pokemon specifically. The way the adults kill the fad by expressing enthusiasm for it themselves is a fairly precise description of how institutional adoption of youth culture tends to work. The moment parents are on TikTok, the moment brands are doing the viral dance, the moment school administrators have a lesson plan about the current trend, the moment the trend dies, the kids don't consciously decide to abandon it. The social signal changes. The thing that made it theirs is gone. South Park knew that in 1999. That's quite early to know it. This section is a bit different from everything else we've covered tonight because the prediction here isn't about the world outside the show. It's about the show's own reception. And it's the one that I think reflects most clearly on the broader question of what South Park actually understands about the relationship between satire, fear, and institutional behavior. In 2006, South Park aired a two-part episode called Cartoon Wars. that addressed the controversy around Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten's publication of cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad. The episode was partly about that specific controversy and partly about Family Guy and how it handled the question of what gets shown and what gets censored for self-protective reasons. Comedy Central ended up censoring an image of Muhammad in the episode. Parker and Stone were, to put it mildly, not pleased. But the more significant Muhammad-related moment came in 2010 with the episodes 200 and 201. These two episodes depicted Muhammad as a character, not in a disrespectful way, not in any way that was actually out of line with how the show had depicted him in a 2001 episode called Super Best Friends, which aired without controversy. And the response was significant enough that Comedy Central censored the episodes heavily before broadcast, bleeping out all references to Muhammad and removing what would have been a key moment in the finale. The censored versions were broadcast. The episodes were subsequently removed from South Park Studios' online archive, where every other episode of the show could be watched for free, and they have remained unavailable through official channels since. Parker and Stone's response was to say what they thought about it clearly and to continue making the show. Here's the theory the fan community had been building around this, starting well before 200 and 201 aired. The argument was that the most important thing South Park's Muhammad episodes would reveal was not about the religion or the controversy, but about how media institutions behave when something they distribute becomes the subject of credible threats. The theory held that the network, and by extension the broader media ecosystem, would demonstrate that they were less committed to the principles they publicly espoused. Free expression, consistent satirical standards, the idea that comedy should be able to address any subject than they claimed to be when the stakes became real. That's what happened. Comedy Central censored the episodes. They did not do this for other religious groups depicted in the show. They did not apply the same standard consistently. They made a practical decision under the specific pressure that existed at the time, which is a defensible choice in isolation. But the fan theory was that they would make that choice and make it in a way that would expose the gap between the network's stated values and its behavior under pressure. The show itself seems to have understood this was coming. Cartoon Wars, 4 years before 200 and 201, is partly about exactly this dynamic. A network decides whether to air a Family Guy episode that depicts Muhammad, and the decision-making process is explicitly about managing risk rather than about artistic principle or consistency. The network's actual position is revealed to be, we'll censor anything that poses a genuine threat to our physical safety and business interests, while publicly framing our editorial decisions in terms of values. The values are real enough. They're just secondary. In the years following 2010, this pattern, in which South Park had described repeatedly and which its own reception then confirmed, became a mainstream discussion point. Not just about South Park, about which groups and subjects could be addressed critically in public cultural discourse, and about whether the stated commitment to equal treatment was being applied consistently. The Muhammad censorship was one data point among many. What's strange about this one is that the show's accuracy here wasn't about predicting something external. It was about predicting something that would be done to the show itself. Parker and Stone made episodes that described how networks behave when threatened, and then their network behaved the way their episodes described. And the episodes that best illustrated their argument were the ones that got removed from the archive. There's something almost too neat about that. The evidence for the theory is the suppression of the evidence. I'll be honest, this one sits uncomfortably in a way that the others don't, because it's not simply a case of South Park getting something right about the world. It's a case of South Park being right about the institutions it was working within. And the institutions confirmed it in the most unambiguous possible way. Not by doing something they said they wouldn't do, by doing exactly what the show said they would do. Whether that reflects well on Parker and Stone for seeing it coming, or poorly on Comedy Central for walking directly into the pattern the show had described, or both, I'm not sure. Probably both. The broader implication, and this is where the fan theory extends beyond the specific Muhammad situation, is that South Park has a consistent understanding of institutional self-interest that is usually more accurate than the institutions would prefer. The show depicts organizations as operating primarily in their own interests, wrapping that operation in principled language, and abandoning the principled language the moment the self-interest requires it. This is not a cynical framing that the show imposes on institutions that are actually more principled. It's an observation that has been confirmed repeatedly by how those institutions actually behave. The Muhammad episodes are the clearest example because the evidence is the absence of the episodes. This is probably the theory that requires the most careful handling, so let me be precise about what it is and what it isn't. It's not a claim that South Park is a document about online radicalization specifically. It's a claim that Eric Cartman, as a character study built across the show's entire run, describes the same kind of radicalization pattern that researchers and journalists were still trying to name years after the character was created, and that the fan theory community identified these parallels before they were widely discussed anywhere else. Let me describe Cartman as a character, stripped of the comedy. He's a child who feels profoundly misunderstood and undervalued by the world around him. He has an enormous sense of his own importance that is consistently unconfirmed by external reality. He responds to that gap in between how he sees himself and how the world treats him, not by moderating his self-conception, but by developing an increasingly sophisticated apparatus of resentment and justification. He identifies groups that he can hold responsible for his failures and frustrations. He builds elaborate narratives in which he is the righteous actor, and his enemies are the source of everything wrong in his world. He recruits allies through a combination of genuine social facility. He is genuinely charming when he chooses to be, and manipulation. And then there's the specific quality that Parker and Stone have articulated in interviews. Cartman believes himself to be the hero of his own story. Not in the vague sense that everyone is the hero of their own story, in the specific sense that he has constructed a complete moral universe in which his actions, however extreme, are justified by the unique righteousness of his cause and the unique vileness of his enemies. Fans started mapping this onto real-world radicalization patterns in the mid-2000s when the language of online radicalization began entering mainstream discourse more prominently. The pipeline model, the idea that certain personality types exposed to certain content environments could be guided through a series of increasingly extreme positions, had certain structural similarities to the way Cartman operates. The grievance-driven narrative structure, the identification of internal enemies, the escalating justification for escalating behavior, the community of validation. Is this confirmed by Parker and Stone as intentional? They've said various things at various times. They've suggested that Cartman is partly a portrait of a specific American archetype, the person who has absorbed a culture of individualism and exceptionalism, and has no internal mechanism for mediating those absorbed values against any social obligation. They've talked about Cartman as fundamentally a product of his environment, shaped by a mother who indulged everything and a culture that told him he was special. But they've also said many things in many directions, and reading too much intention into their interviews is its own kind of theory-making. What's not in dispute is the character's internal consistency. Cartman is not random. He's not just doing whatever the episode requires. His actions across every season the show has run have an internal logic that fits together. The willingness to go to any length when sufficiently motivated, the specific combination of intelligence and moral vacancy, the way his empathy appears and disappears depending on whether the person in front of him is useful to him. There are Cartman episodes that revisit his capacity for genuine feeling. The Poor Kid contains a moment that surprised many viewers, and Crack Baby Athletic Association contains a moment of what looks like real friendship before Cartman destroys it. and the consistency of the character across those variations is something the show has maintained with considerable care. The Scott Tenorman Must Die episode from Season 5 is often cited as the defining Cartman episode, the one that crystallizes what he is. The episode follows Cartman taking an elaborate, escalating revenge on an older boy who tricked him out of money. The revenge Cartman eventually takes is genuinely shocking, not just by television standards, but by any standard. It involves the deaths of Scott's parents and the use of their remains in a chili dish that Cartman serves to Scott. It's horrible. It's also within the show's internal logic presented as Cartman being exactly what he has always been. The capacity was always there. It just needed the right provocation and enough time. The fan theory about Cartman and radicalization holds that Scott Tenorman Must Die is the point at which the show committed, fully and unambiguously, to showing where this character's arc leads, not as an escalation, as a revelation. Cartman had always been capable of this. The early seasons were the escalating steps. Season 5 was the destination. And what gets me about this reading, and I'm genuinely uncertain how much of it I buy and how much is the kind of pattern seeking that any sufficiently detailed fictional character will support, is the way the audience's relationship with Cartman maps onto how people relate to certain kinds of real-world figures. You find him funny, you're aware he's monstrous, the funniness and the monstrousness coexist, and rather than one canceling out the other, they reinforce each other. The humor creates permission. The permission creates proximity. The proximity is how you end up laughing at something that, stated plainly, isn't funny at all. South Park has always seemed aware of this dynamic. The show occasionally steps back and makes the viewer aware of their own complicity in finding Cartman entertaining. Moments where something he does lands badly enough that the laughter stops, and you're left with just the thing itself. Those moments are deliberate. They're also, I think, the most serious thing the show does. They're the mirror turns I mentioned at the start of the evening. The moments where the satirist looks at the audience and asks whether the audience is entirely sure what it's been enjoying, whether Cartman was built as a study in radicalization, or whether radicalization turned out to be a phenomenon that fit a character who was built for different reasons, is a question I can't answer definitively. But the theory that he embodies a specific and legible psychological type, one that became much more discussed in the years after his creation than it was at the time, is one that holds up to examination. And the show, to its credit, has never resolved him into either a redeemable person or a pure symbol of evil. He stays human-shaped. That's what makes him useful as a character study and possibly what makes him most accurate. Here's a fun one to finish the main list with, because it involves the show doing something it almost never does, changing its position. Publicly, in a season of television, ManBearPig was introduced in Season 10, in a 2006 episode called ManBearPig. Al Gore visits South Park to warn the boys about the terrible threat of ManBearPig, a creature that is half man, half bear, half pig, and to recruit their help in stopping it. The creature, of course, is not real. Gore's warnings are treated by everyone as the deluded obsession of a man who needs attention and a cause, and the episode is fairly clearly a parody of what the show saw as alarmist climate rhetoric. Gore is depicted as self-important, dramatic, out of touch, and wrong. ManBearPig does not exist. This was the show's position in 2006. And in 2006, Trey Parker and Matt Stone had a specific philosophical position, that both sides of most debates were roughly equally silly, and that earnest environmentalism was as ripe for satire as anything else. Equal opportunity offense applied to climate change. The fan theory that developed over the following years was less dramatic than some on this list. It was simply that the show would eventually have to reconcile its ManBearPig position with the accumulating weight of actual scientific evidence and real-world consequences. The theory held that South Park's consistent both sides are equally ridiculous. framing would, at some point, bend under the pressure of topics where one side turned out to be factually correct. That equal opportunity satire has a structural vulnerability. It works when both sides are roughly equally wrong and starts to strain when one side turns out to be substantially more right. In 2018, in season 22, the show returned to ManBearPig. The creature is now real. It's devastating towns across America. Al Gore is vindicated, not in a mild, ambiguous way. The episode is a direct admission that the 2006 take was wrong. ManBearPig, climate change, is real and serious and is causing genuine harm. And the people who dismissed the warnings turn out to have been wrong to do so. Al Gore appears in the season 22 episode and receives an apology. An actual apology. The characters admit they should have listened. It's played with the show's characteristic blend of comedy and sincerity, but the sincerity is real. Parker and Stone made a choice to reverse a position they had taken 12 years earlier, using the same characters and the same mythology, and to do it explicitly rather than pretending the first episode hadn't happened. That's genuinely rare, not just for South Park, but for any long-running show. The willingness to go back, use your own past work as the text you're responding to, and say, "We were wrong about this one," is something that most creative enterprises avoid because it invites scrutiny of everything else. If they were wrong about ManBearPig, what else might they be wrong about? The fan theory community had predicted the reversal, more or less, not the specific form it would take. But the argument that the show's equal opportunity framing was unsustainable on certain topics, specifically the ones where scientific consensus was strong and evidence was accumulating, had been circulating for years before the ManBearPig reversal confirmed it. What the reversal also confirmed was something about how Parker and Stone think about the show's role, which is something I find genuinely admirable even if I don't always agree with their specific satire. They didn't quietly retire ManBearPig. They didn't pretend the 2006 episode was about something else. They brought Al Gore back and had him receive an apology in front of the town. The joke became the mechanism of the correction, the mythology became the vehicle for the admission. There's a broader implication here that I think is worth sitting with for a moment. One of the things that makes South Park different from most long-running cultural productions is that it exists in real time and treats its own past as a text it can respond to. Most shows try to maintain consistency. South Park sometimes deliberately breaks with it, not out of carelessness, but to make a point about what consistency means when circumstances change. The ManBearPig arc is the clearest example of this in the show's history. A joke from 2006 becomes, through the accumulation of real-world evidence, the vehicle for a correction in 2018. The correction is funnier and more honest because it uses the original joke's structure, and the fact that the fan community had predicted some version of this, had identified that the both sides framing was under pressure on this particular topic, means that the reversal landed for people who had been waiting for it. Not every prediction needs to come from external observation. Some of them come from the show's own history. And this is the one where the show's history became the thing it was predicting. Let me take a slightly different angle here before we wind down, because this is one that doesn't get discussed as much as the others, but which I find quite moving when I think about it properly. The McCormick family is poor. Visibly, clearly, consistently poor. Kenny's house is small and shabby, his parents drink. There is a persistent low-level chaos to the McCormick household that is distinct from the chaos in other South Park households, which tends to be situational rather than structural. The poverty is not played for pity. South Park doesn't really do pity, but it's also not played purely for comedy. It's just there as a fact in the background of every episode Kenny appears in. One fan theory that emerged fairly early, which gained traction over time, held that Kenny's poverty was not incidental but foundational, that the McCormick situation was meant to be understood as a consequence of the curse. Kenny has died over 100 times. Average funeral costs are significant. Even accounting for the fact that South Park's logic is elastic, the McCormick family has been absorbing the financial cost of Kenny's deaths in some form for years. The theory calculated that if each death incurred any meaningful cost, medical, burial, administrative, the family would have accumulated an essentially insurmountable financial hole. Their poverty is the bill for the curse. Is this confirmed? No, it's never been directly addressed. But it has also never been contradicted, and there are moments in various episodes where the relationship between Kenny's deaths and the family's financial situation is gestured at without being made explicit. But here's the part of the Kenny poverty narrative that I think deserves more attention, and that goes beyond the death cost theory. The McCormick family's poverty is depicted with an unusual degree of specificity that, across multiple seasons, builds into something that feels less like background and more like observation. Kenny's parents work. They are not lazy. They are not irresponsible in the ways that poverty is sometimes depicted in entertainment. Feckless, disorganized, somehow at fault for their situation. They're just in a structural position that doesn't improve regardless of what they do. This is a fairly accurate depiction of generational poverty in a way that most entertainment, and especially most animated comedy, avoids. The show doesn't moralize about it. It doesn't make Kenny's family into saints to generate sympathy, and it doesn't make them into cautionary tales to generate distance. It just shows them in their situation, episode after episode, with the situation not changing. In the years since South Park began, the academic and popular literature on economic mobility, specifically on the difficulty of moving between economic classes in the United States, has developed significantly. The data on generational poverty, on the structural factors that maintain it, on the gap between the narrative of individual effort and outcome and the actual statistical reality, has become considerably more available and more discussed. The show, unintentionally or otherwise, was depicting the structural reality from 1997. Kenny's family doesn't improve their situation, not because they don't try, because the situation doesn't work like that. There's also a subtle thing about how Kenny himself relates to his situation that I notice every time I think about it. He doesn't seem to resent it particularly. He doesn't have Cartman's burning ambition to transcend his origins. He doesn't have the aspirational energy that the culture usually assigns to characters in his position. He's just Kenny, loyal, physical, occasionally surprisingly perceptive. In his orange parka, at the bus stop with his friends, in the situation he's in, there's something almost dignified about his absence of resentment, especially given everything else he's dealing with. The fan community noticed this. The theory that Kenny's acceptance of his circumstances was connected to his immortality. That a person who has experienced the worst possible outcome hundreds of times might develop a different relationship to ordinary deprivation is one of the more psychologically interesting readings of the character. It's not confirmed, but it fits. What the show got right about class across the McCormick family's entire run is the same thing it got right about most things. The gap between the cultural story about the thing and the thing itself. The cultural story about poverty in America involves individual choices, temporary situations, and upward mobility as the default trajectory. The McCormicks just keep being poor, quietly, persistently, without drama. And that quiet persistence turns out to be the most accurate thing in the show. All right, I think we've covered quite a lot of ground tonight, and I think it might be time to start winding down. We've been through a long catalog of episodes and theories tonight, a show that has been right more often than it had any particular reason to be. Kenny's immortality, confirmed as real and confirmed as a curse. Cartman's parentage, theorized correctly before the show admitted it. Mass surveillance, the public's indifference to it, Colorado's entire cannabis arc. Hollywood's relationship with commercial pressure in China, the drone neighborhood problem, the media mechanism that consumes celebrities. Mel Gibson, who turned out to be the character the episode drew. The sports team name changes. The The technology fads and their consistent underlying pattern, the institutional behavior under threat, the ManBearPig apology, and then the larger, quieter things. Randy as the true protagonist. The town as a possibly supervised experiment that may or may not ever be confirmed. The theory that's just there, permanently, neither proven nor disproven, asking to be kept. What I keep coming back to, sitting here and thinking about all of it, is something a bit more fundamental than any individual prediction or confirmation. It's the question of what it means for a show to be accurate. Because here's the thing, South Park is not trying to be accurate. That's not the goal. Parker and Stone have never described their process as an attempt to forecast events or identify future trends. They're trying to be funny. They're trying to be interesting. They're trying to do something each week that is worth the time it takes to watch it. Accuracy, when it happens, is a byproduct of the primary goal. They're not looking for truth. They're looking for the right joke. And sometimes the right joke turns out to be true. That's what I find most compelling about the whole body of evidence we've been through tonight. Not that South Park is prophetic in any mystical sense, but that the process of making the best possible comedy about the world as it actually is. Stripped of comforting fictions, without diplomatic softening, from a position of genuine attention to what people actually do rather than what they claim to do, produces something that looks, over time, remarkably like accuracy. The gaps the show exploits between stated values and actual behavior, between official position and real motivation, between the story institutions tell about themselves and the decisions they make under pressure, are gaps that exist in the real world. The show locates them, it makes jokes about them, and then, eventually, the real world produces the moments that those jokes were pointing at. That's not a crystal ball, it's an observational discipline applied at high speed over a long period of time. I was going to leave it there, actually. But I find myself wanting to say one more thing before we actually get to the end. The theories are interesting, the predictions are interesting, but the thing that makes South Park more than the sum of its accurate moments is something that doesn't really fit into a list. It's the show's consistent willingness to be unpopular in ways that don't serve the show commercially. To make the episode that genuinely makes people uncomfortable rather than the one that will be well received. To not find an easy target when the accurate target is complicated and divisive. To not resolve things that shouldn't be resolved. 200 and 201 got the show censored. Britney's New Look alienated viewers who found it too dark. You're Getting Old, a season 15 episode in which Stan becomes deeply cynical about everything, in which literally everything sounds like excrement to him, was widely read as Parker expressing genuine despair about his own life and work, and felt like a genuine departure from the show's usual tone. Parker has never fully confirmed or denied that reading, it just sits there. These are the episodes that don't fit the theory-confirming list. They're not predictions. They're not internally consistent mythology. They're just moments where the show decided to do something harder rather than something easier, and where the hardness of the choice was visible in the result. I think those episodes are part of why the show's accuracy holds up over time. Because the discipline that produces accurate observation, the willingness to see things clearly rather than comfortably, is the same discipline that produces difficult creative choices. They come from the same place. You can't have one without the other. A show that only ever made the comfortable choice would not have the observational sharpness that makes the uncomfortable ones land. One more thing about the show's relationship with time that I keep coming back to. Because we spent a lot of tonight talking about predictions and theories, and I want to say something about what I think the real value of all of this is. Because I don't think it's the predictions themselves. I don't think the impressive thing about South Park is that it called the NSA surveillance story, or the Mel Gibson anti-Semitism, or the Colorado cannabis arc. Those are interesting, they're worth documenting, but they're not the point. The point, I think, is that the show represents a kind of continuous record of the present tense. Because of the production cycle we talked about at the start, the speed of it, the ability to respond within the same week something happens. South Park exists in a relationship with time that almost no other creative work has. Most art lags behind its moment. South Park was always being made and released into the same moment. The present tense of the show was always the actual present tense. What this means, in retrospect, is that the complete run of South Park is not just a television show, it's a continuous annotation of the whole run. An ongoing commentary on public life made in real time by people who were paying close attention and who were willing to say things that other people in other contexts were hedging around. The theories that came true are just the moments where the annotation was sharpest and the hedge-free observation was most visible in retrospect. I find that genuinely remarkable. Not as a claim about Parker and Stone being uniquely wise or uniquely far-sighted. They're just two people watching the same world everyone else is watching. But the conditions of the show, the speed, the willingness to be wrong, the freedom from the kind of commercial caution that makes most entertainment smooth its edges, created something that captures the present more clearly than almost anything else. That's what the theories represent for me. Not prophecy, not coincidence. Just a record of the present, made fast enough that the present hadn't finished becoming itself when the record was made. All right, now I really think it might be time to sleep. But first, one image that keeps coming back to me every time I spend an evening in South Park's mythology. It's the bus stop. 4 kids, every episode in the snow. They've been standing there since 1997. The world has changed completely around them. Events have happened, technologies have appeared and disappeared. Cultural moments have risen and faded. And those 4 kids are still 9 years old, still in their winter coats, still at the bus stop. Whatever theory you hold about why, the time loop, the supernatural experiment, Kenny's accumulated deaths resetting the clock, or just a pair of writers who decided their characters wouldn't age. There's something quietly affecting about the image. These are the same kids who have watched everything we talked about tonight. The surveillance episode, the climate reversal, the celebrity machine, the fad cycle. They've seen all of it from the same place, the same age, the same bus stop. And every episode, regardless of what happened in the last one, begins again. Bus stop. 4 kids, snow, another day. That's the real mystery, maybe. Not the specific theories, not the individual predictions, but the fact that the show has been standing in that same place, watching the world with those same eyes through all of it, and the world keeps giving it material. I don't think that stopped anytime soon. The show is still making episodes, new seasons, new specials, new things that will seem like jokes and then gradually become less like jokes. New theories will form. Some of them will be confirmed. Some will sit permanently in the unconfirmed but not denied space that the best South Park theories tend to occupy. And somewhere in Colorado, 4 9-year-old boys are waiting for the school bus. The same 4 boys in the same coats with the same jokes and the same arguments and the same loyalty that has somehow survived all those seasons of impossible events and terrible decisions and every conceivable supernatural catastrophe. They haven't aged. The world has changed completely around them, and they're still there. When fans theorize about South Park, when they build the elaborate frameworks about time loops and experimental towns and confirmed curses and psychological archetypes, they're not just entertaining themselves with a puzzle. They're doing something that the show invites, almost requires. They're paying the same kind of close attention that the show pays to the world. And sometimes, when that attention is careful enough and patient enough, it finds the thing the show was pointing at before the show got around to naming it. That's the deepest thing about the South Park fandom, I think, not the theories specifically. The habit of looking carefully at something and asking what it's actually saying underneath what it appears to be saying. That habit, applied to South Park, produces theories. Applied to the world, it produces the kind of understanding the show has always been trying to model. The show is the theory. The theory is a way of watching. And watching carefully for long enough tends to produce something that looks a lot like being right. They're always waiting for the school bus. That never changes. Whatever happens in the episode, whatever enormous thing gets introduced and resolved and forgotten, that image persists. The bus stop, the snow, the 4 kids talking about nothing in particular, morning after morning. Good night. Sleep well. And if any of this keeps you thinking for a while before you drift off, that's completely fine. That's kind of the point. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you next time.